Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. And so I'd like to introduce Dr. Jones. Um, Dr. Brian Madison Jones. He serves as the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and is a professor of history at the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina. As Dean, Jones is responsible for the strategic vision, financial health, and academic excellence of the school, which serves over 800 majors in 7 academic departments and 260 graduate students in 9 programs. Jones came to the Citadel in 2020 following 12 years at Johnson C. Smith University, where he served as the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters and the James B. Duke Distinguished Faculty. As an academic leader, Jones has designed curriculum and other academic enrichment programs, prioritized faculty development, worked directly with governing boards, private foundations, and individual donors, directed institutional grants, and chaired various leadership, program, and search committees. He has participated in professional development opportunities through the American Council on Education, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, the American Conference of Academic Deans, and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Jones earned a Bachelor of Arts in History from Appalachian State University, a Master of Arts in History from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and a Doctor of Philosophy in History from Kansas State University. As a historian, his primary areas of scholarly study are post-war American history, the nuclear age, and the American presidency. He is the author of the book Abolishing the Taboo, Dwight D. Eisenhower and American Nuclear Doctrine, and has published articles in the Military-Industrial Complex and American Society and Encyclopedia of Cold War, a political, social, and military history. He served as a historical consultant for the Three Road Communications production of Rescue the Philippines in 2013, and for A&E's biography on Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dr. Jones has reviewed scholarly works for the Presidential Studies Quarterly, the North Carolina Historical Review, and the Journal of American History. He has received grants from the University of Michigan, University of Arizona, and the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. Dean Jones is a native of Charlotte, North Carolina, and currently lives in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, with his wife, 2 daughters, and an Arundel Terrier. Is that correct, Dr. Jones?
Yep, one Arundel Terrier. She's a handful, to be sure.
Well, welcome, Dr. Jones. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and floor is all yours.
Thanks, Eva Marie. I appreciate it so much. I'm going to share my screen in just a minute, but I do want to thank Eva Marie in particular for bringing me onto this particular event through a colleague that we share. And of course, my thanks to Dorothy Marie Lowry, Distinguished Guest Lecture Series altogether for having me here. I'm going to talk a bit about, briefly about myself and my role, but mostly about the Citadel in a very brief way in the beginning, and then I'll talk in detail about President Eisenhower. But I do appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to talking a bit more about history. In this case, the history that I do is part of my regular scholarly research. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. I trust that's showing well on your side, Eva Marie, and that looks good.
Yes, it looks great.
Good. Well, so good morning to each of you. Obviously, I'm on Eastern Standard Time out here, so it's 1 PM here in Charleston, South Carolina, which is the home of the Citadel. I wanted to mention briefly just a note about the Citadel because it does figure in the early stages of this presentation, but the Citadel is a unique institution of higher education. It's one of 6 senior military colleges in the country outside of the service academies, which you are probably more familiar with, including West Point, the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, and so on. At the Citadel, we operate in a military style where the predominant portion of our undergraduate population constitutes the South Carolina Corps of Cadets, which is our, if you will, organizing principle at the undergraduate space. We are located exactly on the Ashley River, which is one of the two bodies of water which encircle the peninsula of Charleston. The Corps includes about 2,300 undergraduate students in the South Carolina Corps of Cadets, all of whom participate in the military model that we designed for them. They live in barracks, such as what you're looking at right now. This is 2nd Battalion, the Paget Thomas Barracks, which is our most kind of iconic imagery. They live in barracks, and they participate in regular sort of military lifestyle. They wear uniforms, they have rank, they have a schedule to their day, which is very rigorous. And of course, in the result, they graduate and go on to do things. What is unique about our institution compared to West Point or the Air Force Academy, for example, is that most of our cadets do not go on to military careers. Only about 30 of them commission into the United States Armed Forces following their graduation. The other 70% go to graduate school, they get jobs, they go off into to entrepreneurial spaces. But the Citadel is primarily fed by this model, and this is what we are most known for in the public space. We also enroll undergraduate students at night. We enroll veteran students, active duty students, and graduate students as well. I mentioned this because I wanted you to understand the unique style of military education that we experience here at the Citadel, but mostly because I wanted you to be aware that the president of the Citadel is always a retired general or flag officer in the United States military, right? So in most institutions of higher education, the president or the chancellor, more than likely, but not necessarily always, and that's becoming increasingly common these days, more than likely is a doctoral, has a PhD or some sort of terminal degree and has experience in higher education. That's not the case at the Citadel. The president is a retired general officer, and they do not have a terminal degree in academic discipline most often. They have not earned rank and tenure at an academy the way that many of us have. And so this is interesting because I'll tell you briefly, our current president is General Glenn Walters, United States Marine Corps, retired Citadel class of 1979. General Walters is an electrical engineering graduate from the Citadel and retired as a 4-star Marine Corps general, which is very unusual, and as a result has a number of connections. Our provost runs the academic show. I wanted to mention that because it plays a role in what happens in the kind of mid-1950s when the Citadel's president was a man named General Mark Clark, who is pictured here on the right of the screen in his Army brown. Clark had been the American commander of the Fifth Army in the Italian campaign of 1943 during World War II, and had a pretty good relationship with his commanding officer at the time, who was General Dwight Eisenhower. On April the 12th, 1955, then President Eisenhower came to the Citadel to visit General Clark and to review and speak to the South Carolina Corps of Cadets, which is what you're looking at here. He's standing directly in front of the barracks that I just showed you. You can't see the spire to the right, but you'll have to take my word for it. That's exactly where he is. And in his remarks on that day, Eisenhower said this, and I'll quote him briefly at some length here. Eisenhower said, "Today, a man to do his duty in the military services must study humanity first of all. What makes humans tick? Not only as it regards to your own companies, to be for them the leader and the model, but since you must be one of the principal apostles of peace, you must try to understand other people. You must try to understand the heart of America and how to translate that heart to other people's. How else, I ask you, are we to achieve peace in this world, unless there be a magnificent growth of understanding? Mere knowledge is not enough. The highest star man in this Corps of Cadets, unless he strives for understanding and achieves understanding, by which to interpret and to relate among themselves all the facts that he may have learned in science and social science and the humanities, cannot be a leader." And that statement has resonated with me because it really does indicate the extent to which I believe, and I'm quite certain that even Marie and many others believe, and I hopefully you do as well, that the humanities course disciplines that we offer, whether it's English, whether it's language, whether it's history, whether it's philosophy and more, are critical to leadership. At the Citadel, our mission is to train principled leaders for all walks of life. And I am firmly convinced that you cannot become a leader of substance without a grounding in the humanities disciplines, that you can learn as much as you like about science and math, which are extremely valuable and quite useful, but leadership requires a certain style, a certain approach. And I think the humanities feed that. So what I've got to offer to you today is sort of a kind of I would say a quick summary, if you will, of Eisenhower's leadership experiences and the extent to which I think they are rooted kind of in some of our humanities disciplines and skills that we teach our students. I put this in there for no other reason than it's my favorite picture of Eisenhower. It has nothing whatsoever to do with where we're at yet, but this is Eisenhower and Mamie at his just after his departure from West Point, and here he is in his command uniform. Both of them looking very young, and they look great. I think they look fantastic. Eisenhower is not known always for his commitment to the humanities in a specific sense, if he's known in many circles at all. I suspect that many people on this call are familiar with and perhaps remember the Eisenhower era as a president, perhaps even those days during World War II when Eisenhower became an immensely popular and well-known figure both in the United States and around the world. But he's not known as a humanities guy in a traditional sense. And by that, I mean, he's not necessarily identified with the humanities disciplines, whether it's history or English. He, however, in my view, exemplified the durable skills that are taught by our disciplines, namely the ability to work with other people, to work with a variety of folks, to work across a variety of disciplines, to write, to think clearly, to communicate effectively, among others. And so as Dean of the School of Humanities at the Citadel, I very much appreciate Eisenhower's sort of bedrock faith in the power of people and relationships to shape events. As a historian, I'm motivated by the power and the utility of storytelling, what these stories can teach us about leadership and the power of human relationships. So I'm very glad to share this story today about the subject of most of my academic research and the sort of fundamental inspiration in my own leadership style, Dwight Eisenhower. At the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, which is the kickoff to American entry into World War II, Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower were living together, married in San Antonio, Texas, where Eisenhower was then a brigadier general, a one-star general, serving as the chief of staff to General Walter Kruger, who was commanding the Third Army at Fort Sam Houston. Following the Japanese attack, Eisenhower was summoned to Washington by then Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, and that's who's pictured in this picture on the right, Eisenhower on the left. And Marshall put Eisenhower to work as the chief of the War Plans Division on the general staff. Eisenhower was known for his ability to get things done. He was known as a successful operations man. He was also known as a guy who had a considerable amount of sort of political and diplomatic savvy, mostly connected to his work with General MacArthur in the Philippines. And MacArthur is not a subject of this conversation generally, but MacArthur was a difficult guy to work for. But Eisenhower managed to do it and get it done and didn't complain too much about it. Marshall gave Eisenhower the task of drawing up what to do after the Japanese attack, right? So Pearl Harbor is destroyed, over 3,000 Americans dead. And the question is, what do we do now? And Eisenhower was asked by Marshall to draw up sort of a plan for the Pacific Theater in 1941, early 1942. So Eisenhower took some time to do it. And in so doing, he came back to Marshall and said, listen, in this particular situation, for the Philippines, he argues a number of things. One is we have to set up Australia as a supply base. One, we have to establish sort of an opportunity to resupply that space. But the Philippines were a major issue because there were still American troops in the Philippines, including MacArthur himself. And Eisenhower reasoned very quickly. He said, they will forgive us if we fail them, but they will never forgive us if we abandon them. And I've always thought that to be a particularly poignant comment. It was perfectly reasonable at the time, and Eisenhower understood very quickly there was no way for the United States Army, such as it was, to defend the Philippines against the major Japanese attack. But he reasoned also that you simply couldn't just walk away and abandon to their fate. So what was done for the Philippines was all that could be done. It would not save the Philippines. Lots of terrible stuff follows, not the least of which is the Bataan Death March. And then, of course, ultimately the recapturing of Manila in 1945, which is just a terrible slaughter. But at the time, Eisenhower's judgment was right. And he recognized that there must be prior pledges to allies that are upheld. We must deal with military reality. But people were a priority for Eisenhower in 1941. And he said, these people will forgive us if we fail them, but they won't forgive us if we abandon them. So we must do what we can, despite the fact that we're not likely to succeed. And so Marshall very quickly came, and Marshall's a very interesting study in character as well. It's got a lot of unique characteristics as an individual, as a wartime leader. Marshall very quickly appreciated Eisenhower's intelligence and his judgment, as well as his personal style. Eisenhower was easy to get along with and quickly promoted him to Major General and then to Assistant Chief of Staff of the Army. This is all in the midst of the conversations surrounding what the United States is going to do in order to engage in World War II. Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, but very quickly what happens is the United States finds itself also at war with Germany as a result of actions by the Nazi Reich to not only support Japan and their ally, but also to engage the United States. So there's a large conversation about where do we fight first, and the decision was made that the European theater of operations is the primary domain for American war effort in 1942 and beyond. This was the decision of the High Command and the President and Winston Churchill, largely because Germany appeared to be the greater threat. So in June of 1942, Eisenhower, who had only a year, maybe 7 months before, been a one-star general, is promoted to three-star general in November and given command of the European theater of operations in order to ramp up American war efforts against the Germans. He was named very quickly Commander-in-Chief, Allied Forces for the invasion of North Africa. And it's difficult to describe just how stunning a rise this is, how quickly this happened. This is a really remarkable jump in leadership for Eisenhower, but he had earned the confidence of the man who counted in this particular case, General Marshall, who had the confidence of Franklin Roosevelt. And between the two of them, they agreed that Eisenhower was the obvious choice for this. Now, Eisenhower had never led troops in combat, never fired a shot at an enemy in combat. He had no battlefield experience to speak of, no really command of troops on a battlefield. He missed out on World War I, despite having graduated from West Point in 1915. He missed out on the combat there, unlike some of his contemporaries, including General Patton, who I'll mention later. So Eisenhower became the leader of an army and did so with no battlefield experience. And this is just a remarkable rise. And it should indicate, I think, something about the high regard in which he was held. But I think for Marshall, he saw Eisenhower as a real collaborative leader. And this is important for what's coming next, because both Marshall and Roosevelt recognized that this coming war of allies versus the Axis powers was going to be one in which the United States was going to have to work well with others, including the English or the British, and the French, and the exiled Dutch and the exiled Poles, and for that matter, the Soviet Union, that you were going to need somebody in a position of command who was an effective communicator, who was friendly, who was sincere, who could still get things done, but not alienate allies. And so Eisenhower was placed in charge, I think, for those reasons. Not to mention, of course, his operational skill and his judgment from a strategic standpoint. So his first move is he's given command of the first seaborne invasion of what is then French West Africa, I should say, and what became Operation Torch. So the war is going to move quickly from our standpoint because we're tracking Eisenhower here. Eisenhower became commander of Operation Torch, and Torch was an invasion of the West African coast in order to attack at some sort of lesser German units, but it's also designed to get America in the war. Keep in mind, the United States has had no major standing army and only fought briefly at the end of World War I. Very little combat experience in the army, and as a result, the United States is a very green force, and you can't just throw them in against the Germans in France in 1942, they'll get destroyed. So you have to start small, if you will, and West Africa was the place chosen for that engagement. Torch required intelligence and skill and strategic thinking, and Eisenhower had to manage all that in addition to the delicate politics of attacking the colonial possessions of France. At that point in time, most of West Africa was under French control. Now, of course, half of it was Free France and the other half was Vichy France. The Vichy were the French collaborators with the German Reich, which had taken over France 2 years before. So Eisenhower walks into this knowing he has to attack French West Africa, and also knowing that if he has to fight the Germans and the French Vichy soldiers, that he's going to be in a world of trouble. So he has to figure out how to navigate around dealing with the French on ground in West Africa, and otherwise to advance inland and take on the Germans later. And that meant he had to deal with this character, who's positioned here on the far left of your screen. So to the right is Nazi Hermann Goering. In the middle of the screen is General Henri Philippe Pétain, who is the leader of Vichy France and a Nazi collaborator. And on the far left is Admiral Jean Darlan, French naval commander-in-chief under the Vichy government. He is a Nazi stooge at worst. He is a dubious double dealer at best. Through Mark Clark, who again, president of the Citadel in 1955, but in 1942, a deputy of Eisenhower's, Eisenhower agreed to recognize Darlan as the chief political and military spokesman for France if French forces in West Africa agreed not to oppose the Allied landings associated with Torch. So Eisenhower is striking a political deal here to save himself some serious bloodshed. He knew there would be blowback. He knew that people were going to be upset with this agreement that he makes with ultimately a Vichy government official. But he concluded that the risk to Allied lives in the invasion of West Africa was far worse than it would be to recognize Darlan as a leader, even if Darlan had been Vichy and was, of course, not a popular figure. And as Eisenhower expected, making a deal with Darlan to save his troops on the battlefield provoked a very nasty reaction from Winston Churchill, from many other allies. And this reaction, this blowback, as Eisenhower thought, fell almost entirely on him, on Eisenhower. And he nearly lost his command for this. He nearly was relieved of his command of Torch as a result of the deal that he made with Darlan. It's clear to me, at least, that Eisenhower made this decision. He made what he believes was the right decision. And he did so on his own so that his superiors did not have to take the blame for it. Eisenhower said repeatedly to Marshall and to Roosevelt, I am expendable, but you are not. So it wasn't a question of whether Eisenhower was going to take some heat. He knew it, but he would take that heat so that others didn't have to. But he firmly believed that this was the best strategic decision for the Allied army. Again, at the time, it was wickedly unpopular. It made the papers all over the world, and a lot of folks were very disgusted by this. Now, in the end, these things will blow over, but at the moment, it was a serious political gaffe, although Eisenhower himself would say this was the only choice that I could make. He was not willing to put his troops in harm's way if he could make a deal on the side, which would relieve some of the pressure on those green troops landing in North Africa and West Africa. These are the landings, by the way, mostly at places like Algiers and Iran and Casablanca and Morocco. But this was just one aspect of the problem he had to solve. One was, of course, an operational problem. One was a diplomatic problem that he's navigating through. And the other related to even his allies, because the truth of the matter is that the operation that you're looking at in front of you, the invasion of Western Africa and North Africa via the Mediterranean and Atlantic, was really not something that Eisenhower wanted to do. And for that matter, neither did Marshall. Neither of them wanted to use the supplies and equipment and personnel that they had in small numbers to invade North Africa when Europe, and in particular France, was the real target. Both Marshall and Eisenhower argued fervently against an operation in West Africa as an unnecessary distraction from what would become the main war effort. But they were overruled, both men were, by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, who said we needed to get the American army into the war as quickly as possible. And in the meantime, we'd start prepping for ultimately what becomes the invasion of France, which I'll talk about shortly. And so what I'm saying here is that orders are orders. Eisenhower took his orders from Marshall, and Marshall took his orders from the president, and neither of them wanted Torch, but they did it anyway because they were ordered to do so and because they realized that the political decision had been made. This is, of course, hopefully characteristics we would instill across all disciplines and all areas, but the truth of the matter is Eisenhower was doing his duty here with a certain amount of character and professionalism, I think is revealing about his kind of experience in the world. But it's not just among his internal politics that he's navigating competing interests. He's also working with two major allies who didn't share a vision for how to prosecute the war. At the time, and this is 42, 43, getting into 43, Allied war effort was dominated by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, President of the United States on one side, obviously, and Prime Minister of Great Britain on the other. And they delegated their authority to a combined chiefs of staff arrangement, which was basically the military chiefs for both the United States and Britain into one single body. And it was that group, the combined chiefs, ultimately to which Eisenhower would report when he is operating as Supreme Commander. So Eisenhower, from his headquarters at Gibraltar, and you can see it there just between Spanish Morocco and Spain there, was, by the way, an awful place to work. It was inside basically a large granite mountain, and it was damp, and it was sort of not a pleasant place to work from, but Eisenhower did it anyway. He supervised the torch landings, the 3 separate landings, Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, over 3 days in November of 1942, which put about 73,000 predominantly American, but some British troops as well on the ground in West Africa as the first significant American and British joint offensive of World War II. So the torch operation was a success. It wasn't flawless, let's say it that way, but it did produce success. And ultimately the United States and the British were able to drive German and Italian forces across the desert and back towards Libya and Egypt. And Eisenhower was subsequently chosen then by the Command Chiefs of Staff to command what would come next. In this case, the invasion of Italy. From the launching point of North Africa, the plan was for American and British troops to kind of leapfrog the Mediterranean to Sicily and Messina and the southern part of Italy, and ultimately march up into what Winston Churchill called the soft underbelly of Germany. But again, another situation where both Roosevelt and Marshall and Eisenhower were really hoping to skip Italy and go straight to France. Neither of them ultimately wanted to invade here either, but had to work as a team, had to work with their allies, and were ultimately convinced by Winston Churchill and the British chiefs that the best move was to strike at Italy and ultimately get at Germany from the south. And so Operation Husky is conceived in part by Eisenhower's planners, and Eisenhower builds a coalition to ultimately launch that effort, uniting a variety of nations into a single fighting force and managing the logistics for yet another massive military campaign. And the challenge that Eisenhower is increasingly facing now is one in which I think folks versed in the humanities are best equipped to manage, which is the outsized personalities that Eisenhower is going to be dealing with in Italy. And this is a real challenge because Eisenhower, at this point in time, was a 3-star general, lieutenant general, and he's often outranked by many of his subordinates, which is a very unusual military situation, to say the least. When you combine 2 armies like this, you're going to get some weirdness. But in this case, Eisenhower's rank did not make him superior to many of the folks who were reporting directly to him based on the arrangement. And of course, as we already noted, he had considerably less battlefield experience than did his allies in the war. So Eisenhower is dealing with British commanders like Sir Harold Alexander, who was his primary deputy in the Husky invasion. Alexander is a British general, very competent. Eisenhower very much liked him. And Alexander's 2 field commanders were British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who will become a player later, and General George Patton, who has also considerable recognition in the United States, in particular. Patton's pictured here in this image. So if you'll note, there's a preponderance of British command below Eisenhower, who is an American general without battlefield experience, with slightly lesser rank than some of them. And the British had little confidence in American fighting capacity, even after Torch, which many of them saw as a disaster in several ways. The British were not encouraged by the victory in North Africa, and the Americans seemed to be unprepared for war. And yet Eisenhower, the man without a battlefield commission of any sort, is given command of the entire effort. So he's dealing with really powerful people, important people, intelligent people, many of whom doubt his ability to lead, and he's got to navigate through that to get this job done. Alexander gave the heavy lifting to Montgomery and the British 8th Army with the task of capturing Messina. General Patton was giving a supporting role, which he resented the entire campaign, and he was not happy about it, and made his complaints known to Eisenhower on many occasions. Eisenhower, for his part, had to manage, of course, the politics of this, the military strategy of this, and the press. Several occasions he had to manage the press as a result of Patton, who was a key piece of both this invasion, but also Eisenhower believed that Patton, with his experience and his aggressiveness, would be important for the coming campaigns, especially in Western Europe, were they to follow. And Patton, of course, is very well known, perhaps not in a positive light in this era, for slapping a soldier who had been in the hospital with battle fatigue. This is depicted in the movie with George C. Scott as General Patton. That actually happened twice during the Italian campaign. We see it once in the movie, but in reality, Patton slapped at least two soldiers who had been malingering from his standpoint. And that, of course, hit the press, and it turns into a big marketing and PR issue, and Eisenhower has to manage that as well, and do so without actually firing Patton. That was something Eisenhower was loath to do. He did relieve commanders on the battlefield, but he was not inclined to relieve Patton. He believed him just to be too important for what was coming. This is actually a unique situation too, by the way, just for the record. In World War II, generals were relieved, commanders were relieved at much greater rates than they would be in the post-war period in places like Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq. Marshall and Eisenhower had a very specific view of what a general and what a leader on the battlefield should be. And when folks did not measure up, they were relieved of their command. It happened a great deal during the war. Not so much with Patton here, but nonetheless, Patton becomes, of course, an important figure later on. So about a year later, or less than a year later, I suppose, 53 years old, Eisenhower gets his 4th star, which makes him general of the army, and that way he's not outranked by many of his subordinates. He's appointed after some deliberation to the Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Forces, for the mission that will accomplish the liberation of the European continent. Excuse me. This was a huge get for Eisenhower, to say the least. Most people believed that command of the Allied Expeditionary Forces for the invasion of France would go to George Marshall, who was then Army Chief of Staff. But Marshall, again, a guy who was very much focused on duty, and took it as an order when Franklin Roosevelt explained to General Marshall that Marshall was just too valuable in DC and on the combined Chiefs of Staff to allow him to go to Europe and command the expeditionary force. Marshall never expresses any regret over this. He does what is asked of him, as he had throughout his career. But without Marshall, the next obvious choice is Eisenhower, who had succeeded at Torch, who had succeeded at Husky, and begins planning for what becomes known as the D-Day invasion, or the Overlord invasion, as early as January of 1944. That planning is extraordinary, to say the least. We don't have time today to talk in detail about all of the various pieces that are built into this, but one of Eisenhower's major problems in planning the invasion of France was supplies. He didn't have enough supplies. He didn't have enough landing craft in particular to field the size of the army that he believed they needed to land on the beaches of France in order to defeat the Germans on the beaches and move inland. All of France is occupied by Germany at this point. And you've got to land sufficient troops, but you need sufficient landing craft to do that. He just doesn't have it in the spring and even into the early summer of 1944. The invasion target date was May 1. It was pushed back to allow for more supplies, and then ultimately we get to a point around June 5th of 1944 when Eisenhower is commanding the expeditionary force, and it's ultimately up to him to make the call when the invasion goes. They had already delayed from May. The weather in the Channel crossing from Britain to France was just terrible. And ultimately, he had troops sitting in embarkation points all over the coast of England, prepared to depart. And Eisenhower was waiting for the right moment to make the call. He has to calculate the risk of action versus inaction. And he has to navigate the pressure from an assorted cast of very important and intelligent people seen sitting here at the table. Half of whom were saying, go, we have to go. And the others are saying, no, we can't go, we can't go. And Eisenhower, as he is in this picture, was very much stuck in the middle. This is the place that the commander is, and it was his call alone to execute what ultimately becomes the largest amphibious landing in human history to that point that we're aware of. So Ike had made dozens of strategic decisions along the way: where, when, how to attack, under what conditions. And despite those decisions being made, and despite his 4-star rank, and despite his title of Supreme Commander, which you'd think would be enough for some folks, it's just not. He has to negotiate. He has to compromise. He has to convince people of the soundness of this program. He argues with Bernard Montgomery all the way up through the invasion about the strategy that will follow the invasion. His judgment, Eisenhower's judgment, was supreme in this case, but it was not unquestioned. In fact, he spent days before the invasion arguing with Winston Churchill, who had repeated questions about whether or not the beach landings would be successful after the terrible wind and rain that had pummeled the coast in the days before June 6th. The Germans were reinforcing throughout the French coast against General Patton's sort of phony invasion force to the north at the Pas de Calais. Paratroopers and soldiers were ready, and the hour was getting late, but the weather was not great. Eisenhower was concerned that the weather would down the planes who are dropping paratroopers behind enemy lines in the pre-dawn hours. He was told by his one of his subordinates that the paratroopers could suffer up to 70% casualties during their drop, which is 7 out of 10 people. Would the beaches be strong enough to hold the tanks? Was the consistency of the sand sufficient for that kind of weight? Would the German forces be waiting for them when they arrived? Would the landings be met with just terrible gunfire? What of the French? What were they going to do? What about the Allies who are cooperating in this? And of course, assuming that you even get landings successfully on the beach, now you have to take the rest of France. So there's a lot at stake here, and there's a lot in play. And it takes an extraordinary mind with a variety of experiences, I think, to really kind of navigate this. He's not doing it all by himself, to be sure, but it's a tremendous burden to navigate this, even for someone who is given this kind of responsibility. So beyond the military strategy, beyond the operations, beyond the tactical decisions, the politics were getting challenging for Eisenhower. I mean, you could not find a bigger group of personalities to deal with. I mean, each of them was a master of their own universe. They had spent their lives winning battles against formidable foes. They had survived political fires of all kinds. Now they're in a fight for their lives and the livelihood of centuries-old societies. And this American is in charge. I mean, I'm talking about Winston Churchill. I'm talking about General Allenbrook. I'm talking about Bernard Montgomery, but I'm also talking about King George V, Charles de Gaulle, Joseph Stalin to some degree, who was very much waiting on this invasion. And Eisenhower is in the position of having to win them all over, to gain the confidence of all, and ultimately to even win the battle, which is, of course, the central piece of all this. This kind of leadership is remarkably taxing, but I would submit it also requires a tremendous amount of humility. It requires a tremendous amount of willingness and discipline to negotiate, to collaborate and to compromise, but also strength and courage to navigate a host of personalities and formidable positions, all of which are probably personally quite reasonable, but it requires an individual of tremendous competence and character to navigate through this without completely cracking under the pressure or even blowing the whole deal, which Eisenhower managed not to do. And so finally, after a month's delay and all of this operational wrangling, Eisenhower gave the order for Operation Overlord to go forward. The invasion of Normandy launched in June 6th of 1944, and of course becomes a seminal moment in the history of civilization in the 20th century, the beginning of the liberation of Europe from the Nazis. So Eisenhower issued a formal order of the day, which is broadcast to the troops. It is written out in pamphlet form. It's actually distributed all over the world at the time, in which he sort of gives them the charge, which is to begin the Great Crusade for which they have prepared. And then he did two other really fascinating things from a leadership standpoint, I think, two really interesting things. One is he visited the troops that he was prepared to send into battle. Here's a famous image of Eisenhower in front of the 101st Airborne Division, or portions of the 101, moments before they got on their planes to fly into to Normandy the night of June the 5th. They had to depart in the evening of June the 5th so they could make it there on early hours of June 6th. Now, again, just as a reminder, Eisenhower was told by people who know that 7 out of 10 of these folks might not make it back. And he goes to see them. He wants to look them in the eye. He wants to wish them well. And he wants to indicate his respect for these individuals who are going to go jump into danger. It's sort of a remarkable example of leadership. He did this as much as he could when his job made it possible. But it's, I think, an extraordinary leadership trait. So there's an amount of compassion here, I think, that serves Eisenhower quite well. And then he wrote a note. this is an image of his handwritten version, which is an image that comes from the Eisenhower Library. Most of the images that I've got shown for you today come from the Eisenhower Library, many of them from newspapers, but most from the library itself. He drafted a note to be distributed if the invasion failed, in which he took responsibility for the failure and absolved all political leaders of any fault. Eisenhower would not tolerate a lack of accountability from his command, and he was accountable to the end, absorbing all the blame for a possible defeat. And ultimately, he would deflect all the praise that would come from the victory which follows. He says basically in this note to give cover to Roosevelt and Churchill, because Roosevelt and Churchill would be needed to continue the war if this invasion failed. Eisenhower knew if this invasion failed, he was going to be relieved, but that was okay because the war could continue. And that's why he wrote a note like this. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. And you'll note that he dates it incorrectly. He writes July 5 when it was actually June 5. So this is a humble character. He's confident, but he's humble, and he recognizes that he's a piece of the process here. He is not the most important part of this. He's not after personal glory. He's not after the inflation of his own ego. He remains committed to duty throughout this entire effort. And I think that's a remarkable leadership trait, and one which is sorely underutilized today. I think, you can track leaders all over the planet, some good, some very bad. But I think the really, really good ones share a certain amount of humility, a certain amount of selflessness, and a certain amount of commitment to serving the people that they lead. And Eisenhower is an extraordinary example of that. So from D-Day through August of 1944, the Allies under Eisenhower's command landed more than 2 million men in northern France and suffered 226,000 casualties, including 70,000 killed in that 6 weeks' time, which was larger than the total number of Americans killed during the Vietnam War. French casualties would be as high as 20,000. Of course, there were casualties all across the invading forces, from the British to the Australians, to the Canadians, New Zealanders, Indians, Americans, Poles, beyond. So it's quite a remarkable collaborative effort, and successful, despite all the many challenges. So Eisenhower's military success and his extraordinary leadership style amidst these high stakes placed him in the public spotlight. And ultimately, we know, or most of us know, I hope, that Eisenhower ultimately became president of the United States. Now, interestingly enough, I think Eisenhower has been somewhat underestimated as a president. Now, this is not as much of a new phenomenon as it was during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and really even beyond that. But he's been underestimated by some. He's not as well known as other presidents of the 20th century. Certainly not as well known as Kennedy, I think, who served only 3 years as president of the United States. Some presidents in the post-war period are known for the just plain awful things that happened under their presidency, for which they were accountable. Eisenhower sort of gets left behind. He's actually a curious case of a president because he comes to the White House in 1953, some would say, with little to no experience. That is to say, he had not been elected to office before the presidency. He had virtually no elected official experience, and therefore was not kind of a unique and maybe not the best prepared president upon assuming the role. There are 5 others, I think, who can be described as having not been elected to political office before they became president of the United States. Most recently, President Trump. But the 4 notable others I wanted to mention to you briefly, just so I can give you a sense of how Eisenhower's experience differs so widely from theirs. Zach Taylor, everyone's favorite Zach Taylor, the 12th president of the United States, was elected after a successful career as an American soldier and military hero during the Mexican War. He was called Old Rough and Ready at the time, and he was a Whig politician who came to politics by winning some major battles in the Mexican War and rose to the rank of Major General. He may be best known for the fact that his body was exhumed after his death to determine if he had been poisoned by his political rivals. Those who follow true crime will be glad to know that the forensic analysis determined that, in fact, he had not died from a poisoning, natural causes. One of my favorite Americans, not my favorite president, the 18th president, General Ulysses S. Grant, who's pictured here in the middle in his hat with his staff. Grant had a successful military career, to say the least, which he leveraged towards political victory. We'll talk about his presidency very briefly in just a second. William Howard Taft, mostly known for being the heaviest American president. We do these things, so who's the tallest, who's the shortest, who's the heaviest? Taft is usually recognized as the heaviest, the 27th president of the United States, named Solicitor General of the United States, and later to the Sixth Court of Appeals by Benjamin Harrison in 1892. So he was a judge and an attorney. Taft was also appointed civilian governor of the Philippines in 1901, and Theodore Roosevelt named Taft Secretary of War. So Taft had experience, but not elected experience. And again, a president who may not be known to many and who is generally overlooked. One of my least favorite presidents, the 31st president, Herbert Hoover, here in the middle, preparing to throw a baseball, which may have been his best skill. He was an engineer by training, actually, very skilled engineer, and he ran a massive food program in Belgium after World War I and did a terrific job averting humanitarian disaster after World War I. But he also had no elected experience at the time he became president of the United States. And as it turns out, not so great president, at least from my standpoint. You're welcome to disagree. Hoover does not rank particularly high. And as evidence, I'll show you the most recent rankings that I have. These are older now, 2017, but I wanted you to see the rankings of these individuals. You can see Grant at 22. You could see Taft at 24. You can see Zach Taylor at 31. This is Herbert Hoover at 36. This is out of 43 American presidents at the time. Now, this is not a distinguished list, I guess is what I'm saying to you. The list of the four that I just mentioned is not a distinguished list of presidents. They don't rank particularly high. They are determined to be not particularly effective. None of these are cracking the top 50 here, or they're not in the top 50%. Taylor is ranked fairly low. Like these rankings or not, I show them mostly because I wanted to give you a sense of some of these presidents who are slightly forgettable. Millard Fillmore is on this list down there below, I believe below Hoover. Franklin Pierce is at 41 and at least dead last on this list. You can't see it yet, but is James Buchanan, who is number 43. The point of all this is to argue that General and later President Eisenhower is a bit of an exception to this short list of previously unelected and thus somewhat inexperienced presidents for two reasons. One is Eisenhower is the obvious outlier. He's the only president on the list of the unelected before President Trump to be ranked high. The perception of Eisenhower as a better than average president, perhaps even a great president, continues to grow. This is a 2017 list, the same list. These are all historians, by the way, I should point out. This is not a collaboration among political scientists. This is exclusively among historians. You could see Eisenhower sitting there behind what are arguably and indisputably, I should say, the greats: Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. Those four are almost always at the top of any list by any scholarly measure as the most effective and most transformational, most important American presidents. And then look where Eisenhower sits at number 5. Now, again, you can like these rankings or not, so they can be useful in a lot of different contexts. I use it because Eisenhower's stock has risen so radically in the last 2 decades and more. And Eisenhower, despite not having served an elected political office, had a great deal more useful political experience than Zach Taylor did, than General Grant did, than Herbert Hoover did. I mean, Eisenhower had a tremendous amount of experience in managing major problems compared to those. I mean, Grant and Taylor commanded successful armies too, but Taylor's army doesn't compare to Eisenhower's at all. Grant's military campaign was comparable in political stakes, I would argue, as he was ultimately fighting for the preservation of the Union between 1861 and 1865. But Eisenhower, as an American general, effectively as both a military and a political operator, had to organize the free world against the Nazis and the Japanese to some degree. I mean, this is just an extraordinary task for any individual, and it provides huge amounts of experience. So not being elected does not necessarily make one qualified in the same way that being elected does make one qualified to be president of the United States. There's not a lot of things you can do to prepare for that role. John Kennedy is famous for saying, there's absolutely nothing you can do in advance of this to prepare for the presidency. I think generally speaking, that's correct. I think Eisenhower might be the one exception to that. The job that he held, the role that he held, may have been comparable to the presidency when Eisenhower took over in 1953. So given the international situation, the political situation at the time, the United States could not have elected a more experienced, I think, or situationally appropriate president than Eisenhower. He was prepared to defend America's interests in the post-war world. He had to wrestle with the possibility that any attempt to preserve the nation and the peace could fail, and miscalculation in the atomic age of first fission bombs and then fusion weapons, thermonuclear bombs, hydrogen bombs, ultimately, that miscalculation and mistake could very well start a war, and that war could be the end of it. And I mean all of it. So Eisenhower came to the presidency in a very difficult time with the kind of experience necessary to manage it. And it shows. He goes to the polls. Americans go to the poll in November of 1952. They pass over Adlai Stevenson, governor of Illinois, who was a very experienced politician. They passed over Stevenson for Eisenhower, who arguably held one of the most important positions in the history of the world. And by large margins, it really wasn't even close. Eisenhower's victory in 52 was very much a landslide. Now, as I mentioned that because I wanted to sort of give you a sense of where he lands in 52, but I wanted to show you quickly where he goes after the end of the war and before that, so you can see what additional experiences he piles on here. And again, from a humanities-based leadership perspective, the kinds of skills that he's developing when he takes over different commands after the war ends in 1945. He becomes quickly the military governor for Germany after the end of war, and then later is brought back, very soon after that, actually brought back to Washington by President Truman to serve as the Army Chief of Staff under the new Joint Chiefs of Staff arrangement designed and created by the National Security Act of 1947. Truman and the nation knew that the United States was gearing up for some kind of struggle with the communists, with the Soviet Union in particular, and the American military establishment would need some work, and Truman calculated that nobody would be better at that than Eisenhower. In fact, there's some discussion in 1948 among Truman's people that they wanted Eisenhower to run for vice president with Truman in 1948. Eisenhower ultimately does not take that role. I don't think it's offered to him, but there was discussion about it. Truman said repeatedly he would have loved to have Eisenhower on the ticket. In fact, he's rumored to have told Eisenhower, Truman is, that Eisenhower could join the ticket, and if he wanted to be president, then Truman would run as vice president. Not sure that sounds so much like Harry Truman, but it is pretty well documented out there. So Eisenhower had to come into a peacetime army to organize a force structure and provide for the modernization of the armed forces, including the introduction and use of atomic weapons technology. So that's a pending issue. Military unification under the Department of Defense is pending. Navigating General Douglas MacArthur and General Lucius Clay, who are two very powerful Army generals who dislike each other, and they have political priorities that they disagree as well. Eisenhower had to manage all that under the watch of the president, the Congress, and the American public. The Army had 1 million men in it by 1947 with a budget of $8.5 billion and growing. And the finances were a challenge, of course, but the philosophy and the personalities of the post-war Army would be a huge part of that. I have to swipe an image from Getty Images here, so they're represented, so kudos for them. Not a lot of these pictures out there. Eisenhower got worn out, as you might imagine. He had been carrying a heavy burden since 42. So despite the fact that he came on and worked for Truman for some time, he takes the job as president of Columbia University in 1948, a part of his career that not as particularly well known. It was an ideal job for Ike in the sense that he always dreamed of running a college, which may sound odd, but it was really something he thought a lot about as a young man. Now, he wanted to run a small liberal arts college in a rural environment, and he got exactly the opposite, which is to say Columbia up at Morningside Heights in New York City, a major sort of research-based institution. So Eisenhower retires from the Army and joins civilian life for the first time since he was a teenager back in Abilene, Kansas. He had dreams of making a big impact at Columbia, but in fact, this was probably a leadership challenge that he did not succeed at. He was not a particularly effective president at Columbia. it wasn't what he thought it would be. Maybe that's true for all of us who joined administration in higher ed. Eva Marie, don't laugh. If you're laughing out there, I won't say anything about it. He joined higher ed thinking it would be one thing, and it turned out to be just the opposite. So even while he was president at Columbia, he took some time to serve as a consultant to the new Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, who's pictured here on the right. Forrestal had requested Truman's permission to bring Ike back to Washington and to assist the Joint Chiefs of Staff as kind of an advisor. And Eisenhower did that because he was asked by the president to do a duty, and he did it. It kept him away from Columbia from a good deal of time, but he just simply could not turn down these requests, especially as the global climate, that is to say the political global climate, got more serious and more dangerous. And this is something we'll talk about briefly in a minute. It was the same sense of duty which brought him to Forrestal that ultimately prompted Eisenhower to accept the job of Supreme Allied Commander for Europe for the newly established North Atlantic Treaty Organization, becomes NATO, which is still operating today. NATO is a defensive alliance which united Western Europe and the United States as a military and political backstop against the Soviet Union and the power of the Soviet military. But at the time in 1948, NATO was brand new, and many people agreed on the concept, but bringing the alliance into existence was a different challenge altogether. But interestingly, everybody at the table agreed early on that Eisenhower was the guy to command it. Eisenhower believed in internationalism. He believed in coalitions. He believed in diplomacy to unite free peoples against tyranny. And ultimately, that same commitment, by the way, would prompt him to run for the presidency in 1952, which I'll mention briefly in a minute. But NATO became the tip of the spear in what was a growing Cold War. And so Eisenhower left Columbia and moved to Paris with Mamie, who hated it, as it turns out, I believe. And he stayed there for about a year and a half, building NATO, coaxing cooperation from the Allies, soliciting contributions of money and men to the NATO military machine, and planning for the defense of Europe in the West in the event of a Soviet invasion. My father served briefly on the front lines, and by front lines, I mean on the border of East and West Germany. And I tried to remind him that if the war had come, he would have been the first casualty, because that entire Soviet army would have bowled through basically West Berlin and West Germany. But NATO was there to be a backstop against that. And this is a huge task, perhaps even a bigger task than World War II, because nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, had ever done this before. There were no ancient generals to look up. There were no biographies really to read for guidance. That there was only a certain amount of prep you could do to forge NATO. And so instead, he just trusted his own judgment, used his good sense, his faith in democracy, his commitment to international alliances. And I would submit his intelligence and his character and his personal charm was needed on the ground to make this operation work. But he also believed very much in the power of working with people, working with and for them. And that sort of this basic connection to the lived human experience was central to Eisenhower's leadership, especially as he began to spool up in the construction of the building of NATO. "17 months after he takes the NATO job, Ike is 61 years old. He is an international hero. He has a best-selling book on the war in Europe in print called Crusade in Europe. He benefits from the praise of political figures across the United States of all stripes. There were only a few exceptions at that point, and there'll be others later. But at the meantime, he was very popular and virtually bulletproof, if you will, from a political standpoint. And it's not because he inherited a fortune from his wealthy father. Dad worked at a dairy. He wasn't famous for the sake of being famous, the way that we know happens today. He wasn't a completely self-serving egotist and narcissist preoccupied with his own fame. And there were generals, by the way, who exhibited some of those qualities out there. There were generals who had success on the battlefield, but who prioritized their own vanity. Eisenhower was not one of them. He achieved this very revered status because he was successful in a difficult job, because he did that job most of the time with a smile on his face, because he was honest. He was sincere for sure, and definitely humble. And I think his brand of political leadership, such as it was, played very well with a generation that had been virtually hobbled by the Depression and the war. This image actually is from later in Eisenhower's presidency. It's actually the funeral of one of his very good friends, Swede Hazlitt, but I wanted you to see it because I think it's a good contrast of Ike, the civilian, standing next to other military officers. So when he does come to run for president, Eisenhower couldn't have been better prepared. This job of president would not overwhelm him. The schedule would not exhaust him. The difficult decisions that he had to make, lots of them, and on a daily basis, would not, paralyze him into inaction. The relentless engagement with staff would not intimidate him. Right, he had worked with staffs before. The nation's enemies did not promote fear in him. He had a lot of priorities, but they didn't distract him from his focus, and the highest stakes of all, ultimately didn't scare him. Eisenhower had seen all of this during the war and his many jobs, and he'd effectively done all this before. He had a truly remarkable set of leadership experiences across a variety of service sectors, military life, private life. And please note that he didn't take a high-paying corporate job following the war. He could have easily done so. He had friends all over the country in various industries. I mean, that path was open to him had he chosen to take a position in a corporation as a consultant, as chairman of the board, as take your pick, and make a lot of money. He could have also leveraged his contacts throughout the nation to lobby Congress on behalf of for industry, and ultimately, that's a path open to him as well. He didn't choose that either. He chose service, commitment to duty. Anyone who runs for president has to have a certain amount of confidence and ego. You don't run for president if you don't think you can do the job. But he was convinced, Eisenhower was, that it was his duty to do so because of the risks that existed for the United States, and because he worried in particular that if he didn't run, that the victor would very likely be Robert Taft, who, not an awful person, to be sure, but represented very much the isolationist wing of the Republican Party and very much wanted to retreat from the international coalitions that Eisenhower and his team had built. Eisenhower is not perfect, flawless. He's not universally successful. He doesn't get it right every single time, but he is committed to something bigger than himself, and he has a deep-rooted faith in humanity and peace, and those are the things which ultimately prompt him to aspire to the highest position in the United States, and ultimately, I think, provide for his success as a campaigner and ultimately as president of the United States. Not so great image here, but this is one of Eisenhower's first tests as president of the United States, which is the ongoing conflict in Korea, which began in June of 1950. The Korean War is known in some quarters as a forgotten war. It was not a popular war at the time for a variety of reasons, mostly related to the war fatigue from World War II. And I would submit has not captured the nation's interests since then, except insofar as that we remember the Korean War because it has left Korea divided into a North and South. And that North Korea has proved a thorn in the side of Western civilization, I would say, sophisticated civilization in the modern period. The Korean War killed about 50,000 Americans, coming as it did, however, between World War II, which was known as the Good War, and the not so good war in Vietnam, which we'll talk about briefly, which is a different set of challenges. Korea is often ignored as a conflict, and so too, for that matter, is Eisenhower's role in bringing the Korean conflict to a conclusion. What ultimately becomes known, at least from my standpoint, as a negative success, and we'll talk about that briefly. So I want to tell you briefly about how Eisenhower as president sort of navigates two main issues. One is Korea, one is Vietnam. Both of them are, if you will, negative successes, but both of them indicate, I think, clearly the kind of leadership style and the judgment, and more importantly, sort of a real intellectual acuity about thinking through various challenges and how they would affect the Republic going forward. And those were priorities for Eisenhower. It may surprise you to learn that Eisenhower, at the time he became president, initially chose tactical atomic war, and later what we call thermonuclear deterrence, or mutually assured destruction, for lack of a better term, as the centerpieces of American grand strategy. Tactical atomic war literally means the notion of fighting on a battlefield with small yield nuclear weapons, either fired out of a cannon or dropped from a plane, later perhaps launched on a rocket. But the use of small fission bombs, those of which would still be bigger than the bombs used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that kind of tactical atomic war was possible and perhaps even desirable at the time that Eisenhower became president of the United States. It was believed at the time to be a reasonable response to military problems. That view will evolve over time when thermonuclear weapons are developed and made deliverable. But at the time, Eisenhower saw, using atomic weapons in the field of combat as something that is possible, perhaps even desirable. Even when he was at Columbia and the Korean War began, he was paying attention and offered the following advice. He wrote, as it regards to the Korean War, "We must study every angle to be prepared for whatever may happen, even if it finally comes to the use of a bomb." And he put in parentheses, "which God forbid." He advised Truman at the time, who continually asked for his advice, to apply as much American strength as possible to include atomic weapons on the battlefield in Korea. Truman would not do it, and the war dragged on. And after his election, Eisenhower followed on his campaign pledge to go to Korea during his first year as president. And he saw, of course, a stalemated war on the Korean Peninsula. We don't have time to go through all of that stuff, but the war began in June of 1950. It stalemated very quickly after sort of a year. And basically, there was a kind of a nasty war along what is now the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea, after the Chinese send in millions of troops to resist and ultimately repulse the American army in North Korea in 51. So you've got a stalemated campaign, which is getting nowhere and just costing American lives. And Eisenhower believed this was just unacceptable, but he didn't see great options. So what he concluded was that there was a major offensive that was needed to get to the end. He couldn't let this war continue. It was not succeeding. It was not achieving its mission. And so something must be done in order to get this resolved. And he considered an airstrike beyond Korea into China, airstrikes against Chinese airfields and a blockade of the Chinese coast, and a buildup of American South Korean forces to resist North Korea and the Chinese. And he said, and this is important, finally, to keep the attack from becoming overly costly, it was clear that we would have to use atomic weapons. Not in the time an unreasonable conclusion, but one that Eisenhower articulated as a kind of responsible strategy. He thought it was irresponsible of Truman to continue to let this war drag out when he had the means to bring the conflict to an end. Of course, this is easier said than done, but Eisenhower does begin hinting that the United States might expand the war with atomic weapons. This is, by the way, an image of Eisenhower in Korea. When he does go to Korea, he made a pledge during the campaign to go, and he went and he saw the battle on the ground and came back and made decisions about what was best for the United States. And his friends and his aides, they never knew what he was thinking on this front. He never really told anybody whether he would or whether he would not use atomic weapons. There was a certain amount of the population, especially among scientists who had helped build the bomb, who said that the use of nuclear weapons after Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a non-starter. And there are reasons for this. And one of them is because the Soviet Union had developed their own atomic bomb by this time. So what do you do if the Soviets use their weapons after you use theirs? It's a whole series of consequences. The United States had a full arsenal of atomic weapons, most of which would be delivered by plane or by atomic cannon. They were bigger than the ones that were used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We still don't have a hydrogen bomb yet that is deliverable, but we're almost there. And when that's ready, then you could really expand the pain if you wanted to launch a nuclear strike. But this challenge of the Soviet Union now possessing the bomb as a result of espionage means that if you start an atomic conflict in Korea, it could easily spread and take on terrible dimensions. Now, Eisenhower thought that the North Koreans were not prepared for this, that he thought that they had expected an easy victory, cheap and easy. He said that no one would defend South Korea, that they wouldn't risk the war. And he said, listen, they miscalculated. We're going to defend Korea, but we're going to do it our way. So he conceives of maybe bombing Chongqing or Peking, is what he said in his quote. These are major cities in China, to attack enemy aircraft and the destruction of supplies and troop concentrations. He believed that if the United States launched an airstrike in which you destroyed specific small targets in China, that the Soviets wouldn't respond. that they wouldn't see this as a major retaliation and would not get involved, that you could limit atomic war is what he says. He's talking about this with his allies. He's passing this message along through his diplomats. He's signaling to the North Koreans and to the Chinese and to the Soviet Union that this war is going to come to an end soon. The question is, how do you want to do it? And I think the case is fairly compelling. Only 6 months after Eisenhower is inaugurated in the summer of 1953, the negotiators at Panmunjom are able to come together and strike an agreement for the cessation of hostilities in what becomes the Korean War. Now, they stop fighting, and there's an armistice, but there's no peace treaty, as you know, which is why technically the war is still ongoing, and North Korea is separated from South Korea by the demilitarized zone. Eisenhower, for his part, and I think this is pretty compelling, Eisenhower was convinced that the threat or the hint of atomic attack by air helped convince the enemy to sign and honor an armistice. He was fairly convinced of that all the way through his career. Some people doubt this. Some people doubt whether Eisenhower was even going to use these weapons. He was bluffing, they'll say, and they may not be wrong. And unfortunately, today I can say, we really don't know. I think the evidence can be compelling depending on how you want to look at it. But here's what Eisenhower did in 1953 that suggests he was prepared to take this action. He approved the transfer of complete atomic weapons to the military for distribution to bases on land and sea, which is something that you have to do in order to move these weapons into the forward theater. The Atomic Energy Commission controlled the weapons themselves, and they didn't sit around unassembled. He consulted with his advisors and allies about the possibility of an atomic strike, and through John Foster Dulles, who is pictured here on Eisenhower's right center of the screen, he issued a warning through the Indian prime minister to the North Koreans and to the Chinese that, listen, something's going to give here and we need to make a deal. And ultimately it worked. And I think Eisenhower would tell you that this was a great strategy on his part, but Eisenhower, I haven't mentioned yet, was a poker player. He was a bridge player. He knew how to bluff, but he also said, if you find out to be bluffing and you don't follow through, you got a real problem. This is not a man, I think, to take chances. He calculated that this is how this would play, and ultimately it works out in his favor. It is a negative accomplishment, though, if you think about it in those terms. He brought the war to a conclusion, but this bringing of the war to a conclusion rarely attracts praise. He didn't want praise, but he did fulfill his campaign pledge to the voters. He did go to Korea. He did bring the war to an end. He did save lives and dollars, and he resolved this growing problem, which was part of the emerging Cold War. Now, today, obviously the war is not over. Eisenhower did not anticipate a 70-year-long armistice. He did not anticipate the geopolitical challenge of a rogue North Korean state with nuclear weapons, and it's unlikely anybody at the time did, but it's clear his handling of Korea was very skillful and sophisticated and a little bit more effective than anybody perhaps had given him credit for in the kind of outside of the scholarly community. In history and memory, the Vietnam War is one of the most politically and socially consequential events of American history since Reconstruction. And as a result, it's the most contentiously debated. The Vietnam War resonates in nearly every political debate. It figures prominently in all aspects of American culture. I argue that today, even in 2023, the Vietnam War still figures significantly in our political culture. Eisenhower's role in the lead up to the war is oftentimes ignored. Most of us will associate the war first with John Kennedy, but mostly with Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. But the origins of the Vietnam War come during the 40s, and there's a significant piece of what becomes the Vietnam War that takes place under the Eisenhower presidency. The area of what becomes Vietnam came under French domination in the mid-19th century, and ultimately became the kind of Union of French Indochina, which is a term used to describe that space in the 40s and 50s into the early 60s before the Geneva Conference. During World War II, Japan takes control of French Indochina and throws the French out. And after the war, Japan has to retreat and leaves behind a little bit of a vacuum for power, into which step Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north. But the real issue here is that after World War II, after Japan is forced to evacuate from Indochina, France wants to regain its colony in Indochina. And they send troops back to Vietnam to take back over what they believe to be rightfully theirs. And what follows is a colonial war in this area, a colonial war between insurgent nationalist forces of North and South who are interested in preserving Vietnam for the Vietnamese against the French, who are considered to be imperialists or colonialists who have come back to take over Indochina, despite the idea that the war was fought for self-determination. The World War was fought over self-determination. So, Ho Chi Minh quotes Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln and others and says, hey, listen, we deserve our own national self-determination. And people are saying, well, no, not really. And so the French try to come back and reclaim their possession, and in doing so, prompt a significant colonial war. That colonial war did not happen in a vacuum. It happens at the time that the United States is growing and increasingly in conflict with the Soviet Union over a number of issues, not least of which is Germany, to a lesser degree Japan, but also the future of Eastern Europe in particular, and they formerly occupied by the Nazi states of Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary and on and on. France is interested in retaining and restoring its empire, and the United States is trapped between these two competing interests. On one hand, the United States does not want to be associated with old style European imperialism in the way that the French had done in Indochina. But on the other hand, at least to Harry Truman, Ho Chi Minh, pictured here, looked to be just another Soviet-inspired communist insurgency, such as what we see in Greece and Turkey and France, for that matter, and Italy and more. So as president of the United States, Harry Truman gave France the green light to reassert themselves in Indochina. So between 1945 and 1950, money and military advice from the United States flowed in to support France's war in Indochina. There was no direct military aid. In fact, the United States was forbidden from transferring war materials on US flagged ships during this period. But the United States chose France and said, we will allow France to reestablish its colony, basically at the hope of preventing communist encroachment into that region. Now, this all gets weird in the late 40s and 50s, and by weird, I mean terribly dangerous and wonderfully complicated, because there's several events in 49 and 50 which make a very unusual and very complicated America's relationship with both France and with Vietnam. First of all, the Soviet Union tests its first atomic bomb in 1949. The People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong is born in 1949 as a communist state, and a big one. And of course, the Korean War of 1950. All those things were happening in the late 40s and early 50s at the time France's war in Vietnam is scaling up. And so very quickly, Vietnam becomes a big issue in American politics and American diplomacy. And in September of 1950, 35 American military advisors called the Military Assistance Advisory Group arrived in Indochina to support the French war. Total American aid for France in their war in Vietnam in 1950 was $10 million. And it's in that context that President Eisenhower inherits the problem of the French war in Indochina in 1953. And the situation leaves virtually no room for Eisenhower to maneuver. Although they appear to be cooperating to defeat a common enemy, France and the United States have completely different goals when it comes to Vietnam. France wants to preserve their colony. The United States wants to contain the spread of communism. So the money kept flowing as Eisenhower sought to live up to the foreign policy promise to be more active, more purposeful, and more effective than Truman. In fiscal year 1954, nearly $800 million is appropriated to support the French war in Indochina. In the meantime, the French war is not going so well. The French commander Henri Navarre orders a deployment of his forces to Dien Bien Phu, which is in the north, a few hundred miles from Hanoi, later Ho Chi Minh City. And Navarre believed that he could gather his forces there and no Vietnamese force would be able to defeat them. And more importantly, he could draw the Vietnamese into a decisive engagement in which French firepower would prevail. Instead, the Vietnamese launched their own preemptive attack on Dien Bien Phu in March of 1954, and their first attacks disabled the airfield which supplied the French troops at Dien Bien Phu, and as a result, resupply and reinforcement of Navarre's garrison in northern Vietnam was virtually impossible after this strike, and the battle for Dien Bien Phu was on. The French chief of staff goes to Washington and thinks when he gets there, he's gotten a deal from the Eisenhower administration to use tactical nuclear weapons, the same weapons I mentioned earlier, either delivered by air or delivered by cannon, fission bombs bigger than the ones at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He thought the chief of staff got permission to use bombs against perimeter forces around Dien Bien Phu. One French diplomat remembered that Dulles, John Foster Dulles, American Secretary of State, floated the possibility of using 2 tactical atomic bombs to relieve the French garrison. This discussion went on in the upper circles of the American military establishment about how to help France without really getting too deeply involved. And atomic weapons were a decision point. At one point, the National Security Council's planning board says, well, we think we'll probably need 3 tactical atomic weapons to relieve the garrison at Dien Bien Phu. And again, here we are where Eisenhower has to make a decision about where the move is. But this option is it's kind of the worst of all possible options. By then, the Geneva Conference had begun in April of 54, and in May of 54, the Vietnamese forces overrun the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu, and it falls after a 56-day siege. The French suffer 7,000 casualties, the Vietnamese 3 times that, and it was a stunning and epic defeat to French morale and a catastrophic end to the French war in Indochina. The French are finished, and they are getting out of Vietnam. Now, the other kind of piece of this is that the French are currently in negotiations to join what is called a European defense community, which was proposed by former Allied partners to help defend Europe. And France, in fact, France basically bargains their participation in the European defense community, the EDC, with American support in Vietnam. Ultimately, it doesn't work quite the way they thought. They lose in Vietnam, the French do, and they decide not to join the European Defense Community, which is a blow to the United States and Great Britain. America forms SEATO, the Southeastern Asian Treaty Organization, to provide mutual security. And in September of 1954, only a few months after the defeat at Dien Bien Phu and after the beginnings of the end of the French war in Vietnam, the United States began supplying the state of Vietnam directly. And American aid comes into the Republic of Vietnam to combat the growing communist insurgency and to train the army to defend against northern incursions. Between 1955 and the end of Eisenhower's presidency, more than $2 billion flowed into Vietnam, making it the 3rd largest non-NATO recipient of American aid. And again, all of this is before John Kennedy ever took office in 1961. So Eisenhower has a bit of a mixed legacy on Vietnam. He resisted the call from many in his administration to use nuclear weapons to intervene unilaterally and militarily in this Indochina war. Despite repeated requests from the French, despite pressure from inside, he did not authorize the use of tactical weapons to relieve the besieged garrison at Dien Bien Phu. He insisted on broad support inside and outside the American government before taking any such step. I mean, he basically was very, very hesitant to engage in this dreaded land war in Asia that military strategists had for so long feared. And he believed that continued American commitment in the form of troops on the ground would suck America into a conflict that they wanted no part of. He was not prepared to invest American troops in the conflict in Vietnam. We know now, or we think we know now, I suppose, that was probably the right call. It gets really challenging here to make judgments on either side, but at the time, Eisenhower was fully convinced that this was the smart move for the United States, even within the context of the Civil War, of the Cold War, pardon me. At the same time, Eisenhower articulated the domino theory, and you can see it here as represented visually, which gained name and weight to the policy, which provided motive for American strategic issues from Indochina and elsewhere. So the notion is, of course, if Vietnam falls to communism, then Laos and Cambodia and Thailand and Burma and then India and Bangladesh will then fall afterwards. This is something that Eisenhower articulated very clearly during this conflict and used this idea to justify American support for first the French and then later for the South Vietnamese to resist the spread of communism. I mean, Vietnam is quickly becoming sort of the single most important strategic area for the United States. And that's, I think, part of what takes place here and part of what makes this such a challenging area for future political leaders. He did prioritize anti-communism over anti-colonialism, which did not make the United States many friends in the emerging third world. There are other examples of Eisenhower's conduct in the so-called third world as well, which go in a different direction, most notably in the Suez Crisis of '57. But at least at the time in 1954, Eisenhower cared slightly less about colonialism and more so about resisting Soviet encroachment and the growing threat of communism. So it's an interesting, again, an interesting relationship between Eisenhower and those around him. He has more military experience than just about anybody else on his staff. He can reject foreign policy experts and he can reject military advice, and no one is going to be able to call him weak or uninformed on that front. This is not necessarily a common phenomenon anymore, where presidents more often than not have no military experience or little military experience. And therefore will rely on their generals and other experts to provide them advice and counsel at the risk of being misled, at the risk of being, in some cases, lied to, and the risk of getting conflicting advice and unable to sort through it. Eisenhower didn't have that problem. He understood this. He understood the risks. He understood the consequences in politics and history, and he understood that within the context of Vietnam, the ability to navigate the Cold War and to navigate American competing interests, military, Congress, industry, and we'll talk about that briefly, is something only Eisenhower could really do. So I'd love to be able to tell you that Eisenhower's understanding of history and the humanities fed every single bit of this, but the truth is that this is an individual who was able to recognize and resolve complex problems on his own. He was able to think critically through these matters. He was able to use his understanding of the past and his consideration for peoples to help bring about what are ultimately, I think, very effective decisions. So, I can get on a roll with Eisenhower sometimes in terms of the successes that he has. He was an effective leader and public servant, but he was not perfect, and he was by no means flawless. He had experiences of failure and error. He had judgments which have not stood the test of time. But I think some of the core values that he brought to these leadership challenges, whether it was in war, whether it was in politics, whether it was in Korea or Vietnam, he brought integrity and humility and transparency and decisiveness. But he also brought kind of, I think, the perspective someone broadly rounded in the humanities. He had a deep concern for the interest and prerogatives of his fellow men and women. He used his understanding and his personal charm and his personal compassion to help better understand the people that he led, to navigate their personalities. And I think his model of civic leadership, servant leadership, engaged leadership, which is rooted in that understanding of the human experience and that respect for humanity and history, really offers a lot of lessons for today. Obviously, those lessons can be interpreted across the board. For my part, 60 years after his death, I think Eisenhower's leadership is still undersold. And I think for my part, you could find a lot worse examples of folks out there to be an inspiration for a leadership model. So with that, I am going to bring it to a conclusion. We're, I think, almost on time. So I'll bring it to a stop there. And I think we've got some time built in here for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. That was very insightful and lots of questions. But let me just start off because early on you said, and with his legacy, about his unique style of leadership. So let me just ask a very basic question. Can leadership be taught?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a real good one. I think the answer has to be yes. Leadership can be taught. The Citadel's entire raison d'etre is leadership studies, that we can teach young men and women to be leaders in their community in whatever context they choose. Outside of the Citadel, I think this absolutely can be taught. I think in the humanities spaces, we do this better than anybody else. A leadership style rooted in a genuine concern for humanity. And I think you can't do that unless you understand the texture of the human experience, the richness of the human experience, the variety of the human experience. I think the great risk, especially as Americans, and I speak this narrow context, sometimes we fall into the very easy trap of thinking that history began, at Valley Forge or Yorktown. And it's just, I think that the study of the past in particular will give perspective to one's leadership. And I think for that reason, it can be taught. I tell students all the time, they talk about challenges that we face as individuals, as states, as communities, as a nation state. And I say, let's not forget that the Roman Republic lasted longer than we did at this point. We haven't yet met that standard. The Chinese civilization has had civil wars that have lasted longer than the American Republic, right? And so these are somewhat, I suppose, a little bit overblown, right? But those are not too off base in terms of perspective. And so I think history is particularly useful in helping build leadership and understanding humanity. Yeah. I think really from a leader's standpoint, you better be able to understand people, to communicate with them effectively, whether it's written or oral. That's something we do in the humanities. We focus on whether it's in a language program, whether it's an English program where literature is the focus. Those are the spaces in which you can really get a sense for who people are, how they live their lives, what their values are. And that's how you connect with people, and that's how you lead them. In a military model, Eisenhower, you would think, could just give orders and they'd be followed and everybody wins. That's not even how it works, not even in the military system, right? Especially at that level. When you're giving orders, they're not just followed. General Grant had this problem as president of the United States. He'd give orders and nobody would do anything. And he was like, what happened here? And then as a result, he ends up in all these controversies and scandal because he didn't realize that despite the fact that he was in charge, he was not communicating effectively and not following up and not able to convince people to do what he wanted them to do if they didn't want to do it. So the short answer is, again, I think, yes, leadership can be taught. I think in the humanities in particular, the skill sets that we teach, I think are critical for leadership in the future. And the other disciplines, to be sure, are great. I love my colleagues in engineering and science and business and education. They're great people. They do extraordinary work and they contribute much to human civilization, to be sure. But my opinion is that if you want to lead, and leading is about people, at the end of the day, you've got to understand them better. You've got to know who they are, where they're coming from. You've got to have compassion. You've got to have consideration, and you can get that from our disciplines.
Well, you bring up an interesting point about the importance of humanities, and I just seem to be finding more material out there that people are trying to discredit the humanities. So it seems like, I guess perhaps an uphill battle we still have to make sure that humanities, stays relevant, especially in today's colleges.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. And you can't open the Chronicle without finding an article about it. The death of the humanities. There was one the other day in the New Yorker, a long piece, at the beginning of the end. And it is a challenge. I think part of the problem that we face, and again, this is just my own opinion, we don't sell it well, right? I think if you look carefully, if you uncover this, if you talk about it clearly, if you make an argument, we just don't sell the humanities well enough. And I think that has a lot to do with the natural humility of our disciplines. When you go into history, you learn very quickly that your life is just one of many millions and billions that have come before you. And you matter and you count in the eyes of God, in the eyes of your family. And that all works beautifully, but there's so much that's going on. And it's humbling. And I think that humility means that we don't often tell our stories boldly enough. We don't stand in front of the room and say, ours are the most important. I'm willing to make that argument. I caveat by saying I love my colleagues out there, but I will tell you that the path to principled leadership goes through the humanities. This is where you become a true leader. And I take that every day on this campus. I'll argue it to the end. Some will disagree, and that's okay. But the humanities have to sell ourselves better. We have to tell our story better. And I think we need really kind of vigorous arguments in our favor.
And I would agree with that. So now that we know that leadership can be taught, were there key moments in the younger Eisenhower? And I kind of refer back to that very first photo of young Eisenhower that you showed us, that we know of, that perhaps started him to have this outlook that it's, people, and I think you put it that he's just a piece of the process, Do we know of any key moments or any early influences?
It's a really good question, and the short answer is not a lot of sort of seminal moments. There are stories from Eisenhower's childhood. He grew up He was born in Denison, Texas, and ultimately raised in Abilene, Kansas. He was an intelligent young man among many boys. His parents were uniquely kind of religious people, and by that I mean his mother in particular adhered to kind of a very unique religious sect called the River Brethren, which was kind of a Mennonite sect. It was kind of a very dedicated. He read the Bible every night. They did it every night in their group, and I think living with her, living with his father, who was moderately successful in business but not greatly so. Eisenhower learned amongst his brothers sort of just a really good consideration of teamwork. I didn't say it a lot in this presentation, but he was very much a teamwork guy. He played baseball as a young man. He actually played football at West Point until he blew out his knee and couldn't play anymore. He was very much a team guy. And I think and that's just an athletic part of it. That fed, I think, his leadership model in the notion of, you can't accomplish these things without some support. I think that fed a lot of his leadership philosophy. He worked hard as a young man. He was ambitious. He wanted to join the Naval Academy, but ultimately was too old and went to the Army. He desperately wanted an education, but he didn't really have the money to do that. So an appointment to the Service Academy was really the only way to get there. But he was naturally intelligent. He was naturally charming and friendly. He had a lot of friends. He stood up for the little guy. He would get in fights on behalf of the little guy in his work. I mean, it's kind of real Captain America type stuff, right? And again, it's an area where you don't want to delve too far into hero worship. I'm a historian ultimately. You have to look at these things critically, but as a leadership example, he did have some formative experience as a young man, and he gets to West Point, and he's not even an exceptional cadet. I mean, he's sort of average. He's right in the middle. The story goes is that at one point they told him he needed to show up in dress coat, and it was sort of the dress coat form. We would call it service coat at the Citadel. And he showed up with only the coat on and no pants, like that kind of thing he would do on occasion, just joke around. But he didn't haze anybody. This is another area which I think is fascinating about Eisenhower. He was at West Point, and at the time, hazing was part of the deal, and he didn't do it. He refused to do it. I mean, his upperclassmen would harass the plebes, and he just wouldn't do it. He told friends, he's like, listen, I would not want to be treated that way, and I'm not putting it on somebody else. So he kind of very much a golden rule type guy, sort of, Boy Scoutish, right, if you look at it in those terms, but he just had certain bedrock principles that he just refused to bend on. And he was accountable and responsible. And I think there are some instances from his early days, but as he given more responsibility, these things really come out. When he has a chance to manage, they really bubble to the surface.
Well, I think we get a hint of his idea or his liking to be part of the team because you show the picture of him being the president of Columbia on the football field.
On the football field, right?
So he probably miss having the team around him, right?
He did. He missed it. He missed it, and it's one of the things he did at Columbia. He didn't have a lot of success there, but he loved to go see the team. So yeah, he always loved football.
So another question is about his book that he wrote, Crusade in Europe.
Yeah.
How much insight does he give the readers into that experience? And then do we get an idea or a sense of this humanities-based leadership in the book?
It's actually not as much there as you might think. So for all of Eisenhower's successes, and I think for all of his skill, he actually was a fairly effective writer. What he wasn't was particularly introspective in that book. I mean, he does talk about his own personal beliefs and feelings and things, and he navigates through some tough issues, but he doesn't reflect a lot. I mean, he just sort of reflects on his decision. You might say something similar of Grant for his memoirs, but he doesn't reflect in detail on it. I think if you're looking at something like this, you might want to take a look at Susan Eisenhower's book on how Ike led. Susan is Ike's granddaughter, and she wrote a book recently, it was a couple of years old now, where she does some vignettes and portraits of Eisenhower and his leadership style and the kinds of values that he brought to his leadership in various instances, not least of which is the Korean War, the Vietnam War. But the book itself, Crusade in Europe, has a little bit more of a staff feel to it, sort of a staff report kind of feel, because that's ultimately what Eisenhower was. He was a staff officer, and he was an extraordinary one, and he's just given command of the forces. And so when the time comes for him to write this stuff, it sort of comes out with that same sort of style. So it's not as introspective as you might hope, but there are definitely a lot of folks who have come to the table after that, who have worked hard to understand Eisenhower's leadership style. And I tell people I don't know what this says about me, but I tell people, I don't read leadership books, right? I read books about leaders, and that gets me where I want to be. And not just good leaders, but bad leaders too. I was reading a book which had General Douglas MacArthur at the center, who was arguably the antithesis of Dwight Eisenhower. The two men could not be more different in terms of their outlook and their attitude. And I'm just not a MacArthur person. I'm not really a Patton person either, right? And I think there are kind of two types of those. You're kind of be an Eisenhower guy or a Patton guy, because Patton caused him so much trouble. If you're looking at a pure leadership style, if you're looking at military success, great Army leaders out there in MacArthur and Patton. But I have to deal with many personalities and many idiosyncrasies in my role as a leader of faculty. And I always appreciate people on the team who are selfless and willing to continue to work, who are team oriented, who do the best with what they've got in front of them, who don't ask for the moon, who don't complain, who don't spend a lot of time, fluffing their own egos, right? So when I look at past leaders, I'm like, oh boy, that's somebody I would want to work with, manage with, and so, and I was certainly one of those individuals, very much a team player. But Crusade in Europe is a valuable document, but it doesn't have a huge amounts of introspection.
Well, it could also be a sign of the times when the book was published too. I mean, it just seems the more modern approach, that people feel compelled to write every little detail, about their life, and such. So thank you. But I want to ask this question because I was also surprised. But why the endorsement of atomic weapons? I mean, did scientists know the horrible atrocities we know now, for example? I mean, and I could see where perhaps he used the atomic threat as because he saw what war can do, right? He knows, right. And looking those men in the eye, knowing that, wow, 7 out of 10 of you are not going to be here, in a few days, kind of thing. So I'm sure that always was in his mind, but I mean, I was just surprised. So why the endorsement of the atomic weapon?
And it gets a little bit squishy here, because you're absolutely right. Eisenhower hated war. He said that all the time. He hated war only the way a soldier could hate war. And he hated the notion of men losing their lives in combat. He realized, of course, that there was a mission to be achieved here, and that was the real point, that you had to get a job done and it required sacrifice. He understood that, but he wasn't going to waste lives. When we get to his presidency and he has to navigate the atomic bomb, we try to remember as much as possible the context in which he was operating, in which he wasn't at that point in time in 53 and 54 fully aware of what would ultimately become issues related to the size and power of the thermonuclear bomb. Not quite. We don't have a deliverable bomb yet, because they tested one in 52, but we're not ready to deliver them by plane or by rocket yet. And then the issue of fallout, which, as we know, is a major problem, especially in the West, when we start testing bombs all over New Mexico and Nevada, and the fallout drifts downwind and people are poisoned from Utah to the East Coast. At the time, though, and again, it gets squishy. And the reason I say that is because it's hard to say with certainty that Eisenhower absolutely would have launched an atomic attack against North Korea or the Chinese, right? He just never said so. And we can't say for certain that he would have done it. I believe he would have. He'd done everything necessary to prepare, but I also believe that he hoped it would not be necessary. He thought that application of force in the way that he applied it would be enough to push us to a conclusion. And ultimately he was right. So I think that his understanding of atomic weapons at that stage in time was actually quite simple. He saw these as another element of the American military arsenal to be used as such. He was deliberate about using any force. I mean, take note, he brought it into the Korean War and brought those troops home. He refused to intervene in Vietnam. He sent no troops to the battlefield there. He refused to do it. He concluded that the risk was not worth it, the reward wasn't worth it, for that matter. So the atomic bomb is a piece of a larger military force that he was hesitant to use anyway. Now, of course, down the road, he'll use forces in different ways, right? Eisenhower becomes the president who supervised sort of really some of the major early actions of the Central Intelligence Agency to apply force in a different way, whether it's in Guatemala or whether it's in other parts of Western Europe, or Iran for that matter. You use the CIA to do things and get things accomplished in the absence of military conflict. But I think the question ultimately is, why the emphasis? Why choose this? And I think his position was like, listen, we've built these things, we've used them in combat. We've got to be prepared. If nothing else, we have to be prepared to look like we're going to use these weapons. And he did so at least on 2 occasions in the early part of his presidency, and it worked. Later, after the development and testing of a deliverable thermonuclear weapon or a hydrogen bomb, those bombs which produce multi-megaton explosions, which are really the giant killers, right? These are just the worst of the worst. These are the ones that produce the fallout and result in the apocalyptic scenarios that we've all seen on TVs and in movies. Once those bombs are developed, once he sees how that works, then he starts to have a little bit of an adaptation. He says, these bombs might not be useful, and except insofar as they can deter people from action. These weapons, he said, really cannot be used. They can be used to formulate a strategy of massive retaliation, where we threaten their use and the enemy threatens their use, and we accept that we're both going to lose if this kicks off. So it was sort of, as they say, mutually assured destruction, and as a result, a mutual agreement that we cannot go down this road on behalf of civilization. So he does his thought does evolve between the early part of his presidency and the later part. And of course, in the later part, he's arguing for a test ban treaty, which he ultimately does not get. John Kennedy gets one, but Eisenhower argued early on. He does get a pause in testing for a period of time. At the beginning of his presidency, he actually argues pretty vigorously on behalf of what he called Atoms for Peace, which was the construction of nuclear-powered ships and ultimately what become atomic power plants, such as most of us are powered by nuclear-powered coal-fired plants in this era, right? So he's of different minds at different phases along the way, and I think he demonstrates quite a sophisticated approach to managing this problem, which I would argue is one of the central political and military challenges of the 20th century. How to wage war in the nuclear age when you know that waging war could be an end of it all. That's a really difficult problem.
Wow. So that leads to this next question that was asked. As Eisenhower left the presidency, he warned Americans of the danger of a growing military-industrial complex. Did he pursue any efforts to help the U.S. deal with this phenomenon?
This is a great question, and I always expect it because it's one of Eisenhower's critical legacies, right? If people know nothing about Dwight Eisenhower, they know the military-industrial complex speech, and for good reason, because as it turns out, my God, the man just absolutely saw the future on this. He saw what was happening, and he described a phenomenon which exists to this day and has a significant impact upon American life through the 50s and through the Cold War. And the irony is, and I write this in my own work, that Eisenhower is responsible for this. So when he gives this speech, and a lot of people read it in different ways, I hear it as a warning to future generations about the risk associated with what he calls misplaced power, and 2, an admission of failure, to say, listen, this is what happened. It completely got out of hand. And now, that's not to say he's solely responsible for it, because ultimately the process that he's describing, in fact, it originally was called this, some of the terminology varied before the speech was finally produced. It was a military, industrial, congressional complex, right? That was sort of kind of an original concept, because Congress, as the appropriating body, became a center point for the lobbying effort for the military and the armaments industry. It wasn't the president who they lobbied. It was their senator or their representative in the House who they went to, and they said, you've got to build U-2s here, or you need to construct parts for that Redstone rocket here, or we want a silo here. And the artifacts of this are scattered throughout the country, where today you cannot stop a weapons program. You can't bring a weapons program to a close because you'll cost some random county in some random district 150 jobs. And that's a legitimate issue, but it has become self-perpetuating. So what did Eisenhower do to relieve it? Did Eisenhower do anything to sort of address it? And the answer is not really. I think he was very concerned, very upset. It bothered him very much the inter-service rivalries within the Army and Navy, but more so even with the Air Force, who was becoming the primary recipient of nuclear weapons and their delivery mechanisms through the bombers that are built and utilized in the Strategic Air Command. And you'll note, of course, that, the Air Force has got bombers and they've got nuclear weapons. So we need submarines with nuclear weapons for the Navy. And the Army says, no, wait, we need nuclear weapons that we can deliver by atomic cannon. So we all have a nuclear force. And it just goes completely off the rails. And I think Eisenhower lamented that happened. He was unable to rein in that process. It spiraled up on him very quickly. And he understood that the real risk to the United States in this period was in part the Soviet Union. But throughout his writings, if you read him in the 50s and his presidency, he's talking about financial issues. He's saying, if we continue along this path, we are going to bankrupt the nation state, and the Soviets are not going to have to defeat us with a thermonuclear bomb. They just have to wait for our economy to collapse and they can move in and take over. He said it repeatedly. And so he will effort vigorously to cut defense spending when he can. I mean, the only guy who could probably do it. I always often say that when Richard Nixon went to China in the 70s, only Richard Nixon can go to China. If that had been George McGovern who had gone to China, I mean, the guy would have never made it back, right? The howls of cries about communism would have come up. Nixon can go because his anti-communist bona fides are unquestioned. Eisenhower's military bona fides are unquestioned. So he can say, we're reducing this force size. We don't need all this money. We don't need these troops. We don't need this arrangement. We don't need this particular technology. And so he tried to take those steps, but in the end, the defense budget continues to grow because the threat of the Soviet Union continues to grow. And you couldn't step up in a district or in the Senate and say, listen, we need fewer dollars for defense because you will be labeled as weak or you will be labeled as red or worse. Those two actually were the worst things. So there really isn't anything worse than that in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
It's a good question, though. It's a fascinating era. And
Yes.
again, really prescient Eisenhower, who said, listen, here's what's happened, and it's a major problem for us. Let's figure out how to solve it. He didn't have a solution at that point.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Jones, for highlighting Eisenhower and presenting him in a different way. Fascinating, very fascinating. And I can kind of understand. I wish we had more time because I would love to talk about those presidential rankings.
Oh, God, they're so much fun.
But I wanted to ask, is it if I can go ahead and put your email on our Canvas shell in our class in case students have additional questions?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Then I'll go ahead and do that. And so remember, if you want to carry on the conversation, the discussion opens up at 2. And then, of course, your thoughts and impressions open up also at 2 as an assignment. That just comes directly to me. That's just for my eyes only. Thank you again, Dr. Jones. This is fascinating. I want to go read The Crusade in Europe and learn more about World War II.
I would read Crusade in Europe or read one of the other kind of epic biographies, Gene Edward Smith's biography of Eisenhower. There's a Jeffrey Perret biography of Eisenhower. Susan Eisenhower's book on How Ike Led, I think, is a great option.
Yes.
There's a book called Ike's Bluff that's out there, which I think is really good. Lots of great stuff on Eisenhower. Historians and political scientists have really come around on Ike and realized that as years go by, he looks better and better as a president.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. And thank you, students, for joining us this morning. And everybody, have a great day. Go enjoy the sunshine.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good day.